Hello, everyone. This is our lecture for Industrial Unionism on the Move for our November 2nd, 2020 class. This is the class we're coming back to after we finish taking our midterms, and we can all kind of breathe a collective sigh of relief there. Before we get started on today's lecture, I'm going to go ahead and throw out our regular extra reading recommendation. Lately, I've been giving everyone 2 readings in case, one book doesn't really strike their fancy. This time I'm only going to give one. The first is that with our midterm taking place and with everyone thinking about research topics for our term papers, I understand that there's probably not a lot of interest in extra reading assignments, so I didn't really want to throw out a bunch of book lists. If it was entirely possible, they might not even be considered. But also, this book covers a lot. In past books that I've recommended, the book itself might actually cover 1 or 2 strikes or one specific industry. 3 Strikes is actually a collection of long-form essays by 3 different historians, Dana Frank, Robin Kelly, and Howard Zinn. You might know them from some of their other works, but they each kind of take a third of the book and focus on a specific strike that is particularly important, right? So specifically, Robin Kelly looks at miners. Dana Frank looks at sales girls in the Woolworth department store sit-down in Detroit. And Howard Zinn looks at musicians in the attempt to organize musicians in the entertainment industry during the later Great Depression and through World War II. Actually, I might have 2 of those backwards, but I believe those are the topics to the authors there. It is available through our library system, so if this is a book you're interested in, I definitely encourage you to check it out. There's a lot of really interesting history and stories there that I think really everyone would benefit from reading from, but I can only assign so many books for this class, but this is definitely one of the better ones I think that I've recommended. It's very accessible and straightforward in all 3 essays, and it covers a lot. But right, let's go ahead and focus on industrial unionism. If you'll recall from our last lecture, we kind of brought the labor movement to the Roaring 20s, right? The end of World War I, you start to see this emergence of a first Red Scare. A lot of things contribute to this, but the growing power of the labor movement, and with the labor movement having some fairly radical organizations in and of itself, like the Industrial Workers of the World and their idea of propaganda of the deed. If you'll recall that, they had a somewhat cavalier attitude toward labor unrest and labor violence when it fit their needs. In actuality, they were not a very violent organization, but they definitely did not disavow violence as a means to an end, and this kind of rubbed people the wrong way. So that contributed to this first Red Scare. But you also, with the end of World War II, you see communist revolution in the Soviet Union. This isn't really something we focus on in history classes looking back on it today, but the Russian Revolution was not limited to Russia itself. There were similar uprisings in the former German Empire. There were uprisings in the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria-Hungary was like a really kind of weird amalgamated empire that was made up of 2 dual monarchies, one of them Austria, one of them Hungary, but they also had a lot of possessions elsewhere in Europe. The Hungarian government is briefly overthrown in 1919, and it's replaced with the Hungarian Soviet. That doesn't last, but these revolutions are spreading all across the industrial world at the time, and this gives a lot of American leaders and businessmen and civically minded officials some pause and worry. And so these 2 competing things and the emergence of post-war prosperity and that desire to protect that prosperity all kind of coalesces into this first Red Scare, the second one being the one that Joe McCarthy is more notable for and that we'll address in a future lecture. But with the first Red Scare, you start to see the government really kind of clank down on labor activism, on any sort of leftist ideological growth or community organizational growth. You see folks like A. Mitchell Palmer, who was in charge of the kind of the forerunner to the FBI, CIA, he starts taking a lot of bold steps to kind of confront the growing leftist movement in the United States. So he ends up deporting a lot of leaders of the IWW back to their home country or other leftist organizations. In rural communities like Butte, Montana, or out in the Southwest, you have kind of mob actions being used against labor organizers. This is actually true of the Deep South as well as the Midwest also. Throughout the 1920s, you actually see a pretty lively resurgence of the KKK. The KKK itself, the Ku Klux Klan, formed in the post-war, the post-Civil War United States South, right, to kind of resist Northern Reconstruction and federal oversight and the emergence of like Black democratic institutions. By the time that Jim Crow and these racialist policies of exclusion like segregation, by the time these become entrenched systems in the South, the first Klan starts to kind of fade away. Its mission is more or less done. In the 1920s, with the resurgence of labor activism, with the growth of the labor movement, and with the end of World War I, you see kind of a resurgence of this organization as part of wider calls to return to normalcy, if you remember that. And so the labor, this is all to say, of course, that the labor movement runs up against a lot of opposition. It really doesn't have the kind of radical philosophy that it had 20 years prior, kind of during the middle of the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, when you had, you know, these armed conflicts going on in Ludlow or in Lawrence. Right, the Battle of Blair Mountain takes place in the early 1920s, but for the most part, the AFL and this wider craft union movement starts to take a more conciliatory tone toward the state and business. And, you know, part of this is because they're suffering their own organizing defeats, but another part of this is because more radical groups like the IWW are just being so thoroughly rebuffed by the state. But of course, the Roaring Twenties, if we know anything about it, it does not last forever. There is a post-World War I era of prosperity in the United States, lasts about 10 years. A lot of this prosperity, however, was artificially created from the accessibility of new sources of income for average Americans, like lines of credit. The post-war prosperity in the United States after World War I is kind of directly tied to this, right? If it isn't for lines of credit being made available to middle class and some upper working class members of society, they wouldn't be able to do things like buy homes or buy appliances for their homes, right? In the 1920s, we're starting to see market innovations in the manufacturing industry, like the creation of the first refrigerators, indoor stoves and ranges. You start to see the mass production of commodities like, well, the automobile is one example, as we've been reading in Manhood on the Line, right? But there's also, you know, the mass production of furniture, the mass production of clothing, of textiles, of just consumer goods that prior to the 1900s were not readily available to people. And so once consumers start to get access to these lines of credit, they're able to buy a lot of these new products. And that just leads to this fantastic growth for the American economy. And it's only further reinforced really by the defeats of America's adversaries in World War II, right? When all of the manufacturing and industry in countries like Germany and Austria-Hungary and Russia are kind of taken out of the international market, there's a lot less competition that US businesses have to compete with. You know, there's still businesses in France and in England, but they themselves have kind of thrown a lot of their own resources into either managing colonial empires or fighting World War I, and so they're not really able to compete with the US as well also. And so this just means, this just makes for better economic growth in the United States. This is also driven up by urbanization, right? A lot of people are moving to the cities to find work in wage factories. But then we start to see the onset of the Great Depression. And a lot of times there's narratives about the Great Depression is like this sudden and unexpected thing that happens in 1929 in October with this, you know, Black Tuesday stock market crash. But looking back on this period, we can actually start to see the the building blocks of the Great Depression being set in the 1920s. And it's worth covering these because ultimately, when it comes time to ameliorating the conditions that made the Great Depression possible, right? When it comes down to fixing the Great Depression when it happens, the lead up to the Great Depression is going to influence two different kinds of plans for solving it. One is called supply side economics, and one is called demand side economics. But right, first we should talk about agricultural decline, because that's really the original source of trouble that we start to see in the 1920s, where maybe this period isn't as prosperous as we thought. Now, as time goes on from the 1920s and people keep on buying these things with different lines of credit, ultimately markets can't keep pace with the creation of these new products. And in agriculture, this starts to happen first, right? After World War I, you see a lot of smaller farms, a lot of family farms start to take advantage of new mechanized sources of production that weren't necessarily available before. In World War I, we start to see trucks, for example, being used for the first time in a combat situation. You start to see the creation of more robust forms of transportation, like army trucks, that the Model T would not really have compared to, right? It's really hard to drive through a trench in a Model T, but with some of these larger army trucks, it's something that's possible. And this in turn leads to further innovations in things like agriculture, right? If you can drive over dirt, maybe you can attach a threshing implement to the sides of one of these trucks, and now very suddenly, instead of a clunky Model T, you have a clunky Model T with very good tires and a threshing implement, and you have some of the first mechanized tractors. And so farmers start to buy these mechanized, implements, the tractors, hoes, like these sorts of things, because they allow them to grow and harvest more food with the same amount of labor, right? If you're a small family farmer, you can just reap a lot more wheat and grain with a tractor than you could ever think to do by hand, or ever think to do, with an oxen pulling like a wooden implement to drive the soil. So these kinds of innovations are helpful in that regard, but they're also incredibly expensive. And so these lines of credit in the agricultural sector are being taken out by farmers to buy these machines. Another example of innovations kind of leading to agricultural growth are the Haber-Bosch process. The Haber-Bosch process is basically it's a commercial chemical process for creating ammonia, which is a key component in agricultural fertilizer, right? If you're going to grow crops, you need a certain amount of nutrients in the soil. And prior to the creation of the Haber-Bosch process, the best way to do that was with fertilizer from animals, right? So poop is basically how you do that. You take animal waste, you kind of mix it in with soil, and you spread it over your fields, and that puts nutrients in the soil for when you plant foods. They can draw in those nutrients, and it's not just water and coarse dirt like sand, right? There's actually entire industries leading up until this point where wars are being fought over the accessibility of highly rich fertilizer. Like there are wars in South America up until the 1920s over a resource known as guano. Guano is basically bat and bird poop that is left on beaches, on the sides of on shorelines, that over time hardens. It can be kind of harvested and then used very effectively in agriculture to kind of make for more robust and more bountiful harvests of different crops. Once the Haber-Bosch process is made available, there isn't this dependency on animal-generated fertilizers anymore. It's an entirely chemical process, and this allows farmers to create, with their mechanized implements, much, much greater returns in agricultural production. It has a downside though, right? We're creating a lot more food, but in terms of demand, right, it hasn't really changed much. The world population is increasing at this time, right? It always has been ever since we invented agriculture. But the amount of food that farmers are able to produce is so greatly increased in relation to demand for food that the prices of food actually start to fall. Our first response would be, oh, that's really great. You know, food is cheaper, more people can get food. What's the problem? Well, when farmers sink, you know, thousands of dollars in 1920s money into these giant mechanized farming implements, these new tractors that make them able to grow more food, when they grow all of this food and they go to sell it at the market, the fact that so much of it is available drives down those prices, and it means those farmers are making less money even though they're growing more food. And when you combine that with the just great degree of credit that farmers would have to take out to access these types of farming implements like tractors, it just makes them unable to pay existing financial obligations, right? So not only do you have the mortgage on the farm and the seed and these resources that you need to fertilize the crops, but now you have these down payments for these large tractors and other tools that you need in order to stay competitive. But the fact that you're only getting so much of money from your food starts to mean that you're operating out of a deficit. As the 1920s start to kind of go on, overproduction and the slash in profits leads to kind of a run on foreclosures of farms who aren't able to pay their mortgages or loans. It also leads to environmental decline, right? If you're in late September and you're kind of up against the clock to pay some of your outstanding bills as a farmer, you might try to rush for a bumper crop. That's, you know, planting another crop right before the end of the year to see if you can get a little bit extra money. You might get a little bit of extra money, but if you keep doing this with these bumper crops, you're eventually going to erode the soil, and that's going to make it even less likely for you to, you know, grow enough food the next year in order to continue to service your debts. So this environmental decline also negatively affects agricultural production. In Texas and Oklahoma, later on in the 1930s, in the heart of the Great Depression, you see something called the Dust Bowl, and this is when the soil in the country became so depleted from overproduction that Oklahoma and northern Texas for a time start to, you know, it essentially turns into a desert. You can't really grow food there because there's no nutrients in the soil. So you start to see agricultural decline pretty early on in the 1920s. It's probably safe to say, and I think some other historians have already made this claim, but the 1920s, as prosperous as it was for the United States, farmers don't really enjoy that or take part in it. From the end of World War II through the Great Depression, farmers are kind of in this system of incredible debt and very low pay for a lot of work. And it doesn't really start to improve until the government starts to take a stronger hand in New Deal programs. And we'll get to the New Deal in just a second, right? So you have agricultural decline. You also start to see industrial decline. Now, market speculators, people on Wall Street, people who trade stocks, they start to see declining performance in industry a little later on in the decade, like the mid-1920s, 1926, 1927, kind of leading up to the crash in the stock market. Now, the origins of industrial decline before the stock market crash are kind of complicated, and it's multifaceted. There's a lot of different factors kind of contributing to this decline in industrial production. But if we can focus on three main ones, it's reduced agricultural returns, it's exhausted sources of consumer credit, and it's persistent wealth inequalities, right? So if you are a financial institution and you have loans out for farm mortgages on farms, or if you are, you know, a company that manufactures farming implements like International Harvester, or, you know, John Deere, its original company, any of these companies that basically make tractors or any sorts of farming implements that manufacture them. As the economy in the agricultural sector starts to turn sour, fewer farmers are going to continue to buy your product. And as fewer people buy, you know, things like tractors, wheat threshers, automatic, like motorized plows, these sorts of things. As fewer people buy them and there's fewer demand for it, you're going to basically have to start cutting your production, right? If you continue making 100 tractors a day, even though now only 20 are being bought, you just have this incredible surplus in material and labor spent that you're not able to recuperate. And so it makes sense to kind of cut production as a business there, right? This, of course, has a cascading effect where all of the workers who work in the manufacturing industry are suddenly, if you go from 100% to 50% production, it wasn't that stark and rapid, but over time it becomes that. If you start to have these massive cuts in production, then you inevitably have layoffs with that. You have pay cuts. The fact that a lot of these manufacturing workers in different industries, agricultural and in urban areas, the fact that they're paid so low and there's not a lot of disposable income that they have available means that they themselves can't really buy a lot of extra goods with their paycheck. And, if you take out a line of credit to buy something, it only lasts for so long. You eventually have to pay that off. And while you're paying that off, you can't really take out additional lines of credit, right? A line of credit available to someone doesn't necessarily mean that they have more money. And so as consumers start to exhaust their lines of credit by buying new products, demand for non-agricultural products, right? Like these earlier refrigerators, the Model T, these types of new appliances that are starting to make their way into upper middle class homes that are being built. As these lines of credit run dry, demand for these products also starts to decline, and so industry starts to have to also cut back production there. Now, people start to notice this issue with industrial performance in the summer of 1929, a couple months before the actual stock market crash. People are starting to lose confidence in different manufacturing industries. Agricultural production had been a problem for a long time by this point, and a lot of banks had been kind of foreclosing on these smaller farms that had been unable to pay mortgages and unable to service any of their other debts, bring in enough money, these sorts of things. Banks are already kind of going toward their own crisis, and we'll get to that in just a second. But in the summer of 1929, market speculators arrive on Wall Street, and they, there's some stock that they realize isn't really doing that well. It might be International Harvester, it might be this food company, it might be this other company that makes tractors. And these stock market speculators try to go and sell their stock, and what they find out is that no one is really there to buy it. There's no interest in buying up that stock. Part of it is because, again, people have kind of maxed out their lines of credit. They can't really buy up new lines of stock, even if there's interest in it. But also, because these companies are starting to cut production, there's just not a desire to buy that stock because it's seen as doing somewhat poorly. Now, in order to incentivize the buying of this stock, right, because if someone wants to sell it, someone has to buy it. Someone needs to be able to buy it. In order to sell stock, people start to cut their price. If you can't buy this stock at the rate of $7 a share, well, I'll cut it to $5 a share. This might allow some people to buy this stock, but it also means that people who weren't interested in selling this stock, right, who are fine with having this stock at $7 a share, they're suddenly losing the value of their stock, right? If the going price for stocks goes down from $7 a share to $5 a share, if you have $100 of this company in shares, you just lost $200. And so before you can lose more money, right, before you can lose more value in these stocks, it's in your interest to sell that stock, right? Sell when the price is high, buy when the price is low, I think is the axiom or the motto there. So more and more people try to sell stock that's not doing as well, but whatever numbers of people who are able to buy stocks at a lower price is not enough to offset the amount of people who are interested in selling stock at a lower price, or at an even lower price than $5. If you don't have enough people buying still, you might even lower that price more to $3. This kind of has a downward spiral effect on certain industries in the stock market. creates a lot of financial problems. Now, this downward spiral reaches critical mass on October 29th, 1929, and this is that Black Tuesday stock market crash. The bottom of the Dow Jones Industrial Average falls out. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is basically this comparative average of these major stocks for industries that are being traded on the stock exchange, right? So the Dow Jones is like, I think it's the top 20 industrial manufacturers. I'm not 100% sure on that. It's the top X number of stocks. Confidence is so kind of shaken as a result of this downward spiral that everyone tries to sell their stocks at once, and this just leads to a complete tanking of stock exchange prices and rates. Now the market recovers a little bit at first. You have this really sharp decline in the stock market. It comes back though. Eventually, prices are so low that there are enough people willing to buy up enough stocks so that the prices rebound a little bit. But existing conventional economic theory at the time is counseling a lot of governments to basically not get involved in the economy, right? This is sometimes called demand side economics. Basically, if there's not enough people to buy a thing, then that thing is just going to have to fail, or that business venture is going to have to fail, and the government just needs to stay out of it. Sometimes it's called laissez-faire economics. And economic theory at the time basically things happening at the time are reinforcing this economic theory, right? So there's this huge stock market crash, but the economy starts to recover a little bit. People start to buy back some of this stock. And so the government doesn't really take any sort of course of action to address these earlier problems that we've noticed in terms of the economy, right? If we bounce back, these reduced agricultural returns, these exhausted sources of consumer credit, persistent wealth inequalities that limit disposable income spending of the majority of workers. The government doesn't really do anything to counteract this after the 1929 crash. And so this actually has a way of kind of making things worse. So as fewer consumers are seeking out lines of credit, they're kind of doing this to protect the possessions they already have, right? We're not doing so hot financially. We're barely making the mortgage. We're barely, putting food on the table. Now's not the time to make another big purchase. Fewer consumers are seeking out lines of credit, and so this means the amount of money actually circulating in the economy is starting to shrink. It's starting to decline. This is a process known as deflation. Now, your gut reaction might be to look at a word like deflation and say, "Oh, that's probably really good," right? A lot of times, when we're talking about the economy in this country, we talk about inflation as a bad thing, as something we don't want to have happen. This is because the value of the dollar is, if inflation gets pretty bad, the value of the dollar will decline, right? If you have more dollars in circulation, but your GDP is at a set amount, that means that the dollar is worth less. Deflation is actually much, much worse though, because with deflation, the value of the dollar actually increases, and that means the real price of a good on the market decreases, right? If I needed to spend $5 in order to buy a good, a year ago, but now I only need to spend $1 because the value of the dollar has increased with deflation, right? There's fewer people taking out lines of credit. There's fewer purchases being made. There's fewer people selling and buying things because they're worried about the economy. Because this single dollar is buying a lot more, the industry that is selling a good is making less money off of it, right? I already made this good and I expected to be paid $5 for it, but now that a dollar is worth enough to buy it and I only get $1 for it, even though I spent $3 making this good and I expected to get $2 in profit off of it, now I'm only getting $1 and I'm actually losing $2 in expenses to make it, right? If that makes sense. So in order to kind of counteract these declining prices in relation to the dollar, a lot of industries are cutting production and labor even more. They were already doing this when you started to see declines in the stock market, but now with deflation, that process is sped up. And this is really the start of the Great Depression. A lot of people will usually look to 1929 and say that's when the economy crashed. But after the stock market crashed in 1929, the economy seemed okay to everyone for a little while yet, about another year, year and a half. The economy kept on performing, you know, it wasn't great, but it wasn't necessarily bad. But these cuts in production, these cuts in labor hours, this process of deflation that kind of begins to take shape, partly due to government inaction, but partly because of how systems of trade and finance and exchange were breaking down. This ultimately leads to the Great Depression that we know of now, the 1930s. So we see a rising unemployment rate, right? When you're cutting production, more people are going without a job. More national governments are actually starting to restrict trade, and this is to protect their own domestic industries, right? So the world economy is not doing great at this point. If we want General Motors to survive, we need to start imposing heavy tariffs on companies that are outside of the United States, right? We can't import Renault, we can't import Volkswagen at the rate we're doing, because it will mean that GM and Ford will go under. So we need to impose tariffs on trade to protect our domestic industries, ostensibly to protect our employment rate. This is sometimes called protectionism, the idea of using laws and other financial barriers, or like tariffs or taxes, extra taxes on foreign goods, to basically protect domestic industry. This actually has the negative effect of leading to a decline in trade. Turns out if you put tariffs on another company's products, that other country or company, that other country is more likely to impose tariffs on your products, and that means the amount of markets that your domestic industries have access to is reduced, right? So in America, you know, it's harder for Americans to buy a Volkswagen now, but it also means that General Motors and Ford are, you know, it's almost impossible for them to sell to people in Germany who might want to buy a GM or a Ford car. So these kinds of protectionist moves actually drive down demand for goods even more. And this actually brings us to the financial decline, right? Now, banks, which had been participating a lot in stock market speculation as a means of income, are increasingly being beset by customers who want to take out what money they have in their accounts, right? The economy is not doing well. The stock market is declining. I have X amount of money in my bank account, and I'm just going to go get it to hold on to it in case I need it, right? Well, a lot of these banks are actually, the way they make money isn't by holding on to the money in your accounts, in your checking or savings account. It's made by loaning funds out to people on the stock market. It's made to loaning funds out to people who are interested in starting a business. It's made to, you know, income for banks is made by loaning funds out for people to buy a house, right? So like, the bank takes the money that you are storing in your savings account and you're storing in your checking account, and it provides it to people with an interest rate, and that interest rate is how these banks continue to operate. What happens in the 1930s, though, is that with all of these farms going under, right, they can't service their mortgages, with all of these people kind of defaulting on lines of credit or refusing to take out new lines of credit, banks are increasingly having their incomes reduced. And when their incomes are not being reduced, it's entirely possible that their investments in mortgaging and finance are completely going under, and they're just losing a lot of money, right? If you loan a farmer $500,000 for improvement on a farm, and he pays $50,000 and then goes bankrupt, even if you end up evicting him from that farm and buying that farm, if you can't sell that farm for $450,000 because no one is around to buy it, that ultimately just means that you're out all of that money, even though you have land that you can't sell for its original value. So when more and more people start to show up to banks and they're told like, hey, we actually don't have your money, this leads to a run on banks, right? My friend down the street said he went to his bank and they didn't have his money, and he's kind of like, he's out of luck. We can't give you any of the money that you've put into your account, and the bank went out of business. Word of this starts to spread, and more people start to run. It's called a run on banks. And people show up at their banks to basically take out their money because they've heard banks are going under. And this only leads to more banks basically declaring bankruptcy, going under, and collapsing. The banks that don't go under basically, in order to stay afloat, start calling in all of their debt payments. This leads to a greatly increased eviction crisis. More and more people are being forced out of their homes because they're unable to pay their mortgages. And this is also when the Great Depression really starts to sink in. The stock market crash at the time doesn't really strike people as this horrible end of prosperity, but by the time there's a run on banks start collapsing, and you have these industries laying off so many people, and these evictions start to occur. This is really when we see the Great Depression reach its peak. I'm sorry, actually, earlier I mixed these terms up. Supply side economics is what the government is following right now. Demand side economics, or Keynesian economics, is the new theory that would occur, that would be basically articulated in the 1930s, that called for greater government involvement in the economy. So supply side economics was basically this idea that you would have minimal involvement by government in the economy, and this would basically make for quick and efficient recovery and financial growth. So the government isn't really getting involved, at least not until there is a change of leadership in 1932. But by the time the government and the economy began to gain ground as a solution to the economic situation, saw like this limited implementation, the economy had already collapsed. So Hoover, who is a Republican, who is in charge of the United States at the time, he is the president. He has a pretty comfortable support in the legislature, right? Congress and the House of Representatives and the Senate. And so eventually, like, there is this realization that the Great Depression is not going to go away by government not doing anything. And so you start to see some limited investments back into the economy by the government directly, instead of the government basically asking industrial leaders to do certain things. This is why we have the Hoover Dam. The Hoover Dam was created during the Great Depression under the New Deal, which is under Roosevelt's leadership. But the Hoover Dam itself began construction as the Boulder Dam under Hoover's administration. And part of the impetus for the Boulder Dam, Hoover Dam construction project was this idea that, like, hey, we're not going to get out of the Great Depression unless we directly provide employment to American workers, because industry right now is not capable of doing that. But again, it's kind of, by the time the government realizes that this is something they want to do, the economy is already more or less at its lowest point. You can kind of see up at that top graph there on the right-hand side. The economy really bottoms out in the middle of 1932, and that's when the U.S. is getting ready for its presidential election. And so we should probably talk a little bit about Roosevelt, right? Because in 1932, Hoover loses his election to FDR, and FDR is kind of a new type of Democrat. Up until this point, the Democratic Party has not really been a party that has been particularly concerned with business. The Republicans are more seen as like the pro-business party of the industrial, the industrial economy. The Democrats are, since losing the Civil War, they have not held considerable political power, really. The Republicans have kind of dominated the past few decades. But the Democratic Party starts to build this coalition of interest groups that have been more or less neglected by the government in the last couple decades. It became apparent in the government's lack of response to the Great Depression, the stock market crash, and the Great Depression's onset. And so the New Deal, or the Democratic Party, starts to put together what's known as the New Deal coalition. And this basically catapults Roosevelt into the presidency in 1932. And once it's solidified through a number of New Deal reforms, these government initiatives to basically right the economy, after the New Deal coalition is kind of solidified into power, it's going to hold sway over the government until about 1968, 1972. So for the next 40 years, you're going to see this New Deal coalition kind of leading the government. It's also going to coincide with some of the largest and most extensive growth of the American labor movement. So political history is oftentimes also labor history. But the New Deal coalition basically rallies around government action in the economy to basically drive up consumption, right? If the US is going to produce a bunch of food, if the US is going to produce a bunch of manufactured goods, it needs to have a population that has enough money, has enough disposable income to consume those goods. Otherwise, you're always going to be overproducing and you're going to have this cycle of boom and bust, right? Where the economy is going to be doing great, people are going to run out of money, the economy is going to crash, and then you're going to have to rebuild the economy again. So government regulation is attractive to a couple of groups. Capital intensive industries, so these are manufacturing industries. These are industries that don't rely on a lot of labor power, but use a lot of machinery to make goods. So the oil industry is an example of a capital intensive industry once you start to have these oil pumps kind of doing a lot of the oil extraction process. Another example of a capital intensive industry is like banks are a good example of a capital intensive industry. Some kinds of manufacturing, but at this time, manufacturing is still very labor intensive. So capital intensive industries are supporting government getting involved in the economy, because if government gets involved in the economy and starts to regulate the economy and set things like minimum wages, like it had been doing earlier on in World War I, you started to have these like war economic control boards. If the government can do this and drive up wages, it can also drive up the disposable income of the working class. And this means they're more able to buy products that are made by these industries. Labor intensive industries like mining or any sort of factory work that involves a lot of hands, they're going to be less supportive of government involvement, because driving up the wages of workers, right, driving up their disposable income so they can buy products, comes at the cost of these labor intensive industries' profits, right? If I have to pay my workers $7 an hour instead of 50 cents an hour, I'm making less money, even though them having that money means they're going to be able to buy more of my goods. Labor unions are obviously among the New Deal coalition's greatest supporters. Government involvement in the economy means greater rights, hopefully, for labor unions. FDR repeatedly said during his early political career that if he were a blue-collar worker, if he were in the working class, he would probably join a union. He reached out to organized labor quite a bit going into the 1932 presidential election. Labor unions share at this point share the same kind of interests as a lot of blue-collar and agricultural workers, right? We need the government to give us a more fighting chance in the economy. Everything's still kind of too stacked up in industry's favor. We need a new deal, as it were. Artists and academics and marginalized racial and ethnic communities also kind of start to support this New Deal initiative, because it would mean the expansion of economic rights and economic welfare, whereas like programs like Social Security hadn't existed before. The idea of government creating these sorts of safety nets for people was very, very appealing, especially towards people in traditionally marginalized communities. If you've had fewer resources to fall back on, something like the New Deal would be more interesting to you. This isn't to say that the New Deal wasn't you know, kind of racist and sexist in its own implementation. It very much is a product of its times, but it also leads to the creation of some of the very first like widespread federal social safety nets that we enjoy today, like Social Security. So there are actually two New Deals. In Roosevelt's first term as president, he passes a bunch of laws aimed at rejuvenating the economy, while at the same time not trying to infringe on the economy unnecessarily. This first period of his presidency, he wins his election and takes over in 1933 in January. This first year of his presidency is known as the First New Deal. And the First New Deal was marked by a lot of legislation that was either limited in its effectiveness and easily circumvented by industries, or it was directly opposed by the Supreme Court for being, you know, giving the federal government too much power. So a good example of legislation that was passed in the First New Deal is the National Industrial Recovery Act, or NIRA, N-I-R-A. It was passed in 1933. Now, the NIRA did a couple of things. It created a Public Works Administration, or PWA, which was basically focused on creating projects for workers to get involved in. A public works is basically an infrastructure project that is created by the government, funded by the government, and workers are employed to do it by the government because industry just isn't able to basically take handle of that project, right? So the interstate highway system, built in the 1950s, not built during the Great Depression, but the interstate highway system is an example of a public works project. The NRRA also, in addition to these administrations, it legally recognized a worker's right to join a union. Now, the legal framework for protecting a worker's collective bargaining rights was pretty flimsy. There wasn't really any sort of powerful enforcement mechanism to hold companies accountable if they were infringing on a worker's right to join a union, right? So we've talked about some of the ways that companies could fight unionization, and they can kind of increase in scale from financial incentives not to join a union all the way up to, you know, shooting at workers in striking camps. So the National Industrial Recovery Act might come out and say, hey, if workers vote to join a union, they have that right and you have to bargain with them. It can make that statement, but if there's no sort of enforcement mechanism to hold companies accountable to that law, then those companies can just continue to not negotiate with unions and follow the same sorts of, do the same sorts of actions they had been doing prior to NIRA's passage in 1933, and the government can't really do anything about it. So the National Industrial Recovery Act, if it were to be a vocab term, was legislation passed during the First New Deal that provided for greater labor and consumer regulations. Ultimately, though, the act is declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1935. So 2 years after it's implemented, the Supreme Court overturns it and says, hey, you know, this isn't interstate commerce. This is the government kind of having its hands where it doesn't belong, the federal government. Now, in response to these earlier court rebuffs of these New Deal programs, Delano Roosevelt launches the Second New Deal, and this starts in 1935, and it lasts until 1938 when the government starts to kind of gear toward wartime production in a response to Nazi Germany and Nazi Germany's growing influence in Europe and Japan's influence in East Asia. So when you have the National Industrial Recovery Act overturned in 1935, the government kind of learns from its mistakes and it passes a more comprehensive law called the National Labor Relations Act in 1935. And this is often sometimes referred to as the Wagner Act. So if you see someone call a law the Wagner Act, they're actually referring to the NLRA, the 1935 National Labor Relations Act. There are some other bits of legislation that were passed during the Second New Deal that were also incredibly important. The Works Progress Administration and the Social Security Administration are two examples. The important thing about the NLRA for labor history purposes, at least in this lecture, is that while the NIRA did not have an enforcement mechanism to protect workers' rights, the NLRA, or the Wagner Act, created the National Labor Relations Board, or NLRB. The National Labor Relations Board still exists today. It's under the Department of Labor in the US government. And the NLRB is basically tasked with monitoring union elections, organization drives by unions, and the policies and practices that are taken by companies in the realm of labor and workers' rights that might go against certain laws and regulations. The NLRB is basically the enforcement mechanism that the NIRA did not have 2 years prior. So again, if we're going with a vocabulary term, the Wagner Act, or NLRA, is legislation passed in 1935 as a part of the Second New Deal. The NLRA reasserted the rights of workers to bargain collectively and in independent unions, and included regulations for union elections and the collective bargaining process. This is where you start to see the legality of bargaining in good faith. Is a company bargaining in good faith with unions, or is the company trying to union bust? Is a company firing people who are involved in the union as a line of discrimination? These are all things that the NLRB might be called to look at. Now, the Wagner Act, or the NLRA, right? We're going to move toward calling it the Wagner Act now. The passage of the Wagner Act is incredibly important for this period in American history, and I think you could say it's one of the key turning points in American labor history generally, because it's the first time that not only does government recognize the right of a worker to join a union. Prior to this point, at its most agreeable point in time, the U.S. government would say, "Hey, it's between employers and industry if they want to have a union or not." With the government coming out and saying you have a right to be in a union, and not only do you have that right, but we now have an enforcement mechanism to make sure that right is protected, you start to see the likelihood of industrial unionism taking off greatly increased. This is because when you have these sorts of labor protections, the process of de-skilling as a means to control the point of production, right, control the shop floor, is greatly diminished. Prior to the NLRA, the Wagner Act, if a business wanted to break a union, they would find a way to de-skill that task that the craft unions had organized around. And once you could de-skill that process and you could put workers who weren't, in that craft, didn't have that special skill, you could put workers on that assignment, and suddenly it was a very easy way to push craft unions out the door because, hey, we don't need your specialized labor anymore. We found a way around it, and we can just employ quote unquote unskilled workers. Of course, these workers are skilled, but it was a way to basically drive down wages. It's you don't have to know that much for this job, so we're going to pay you less to do it. There's contemporary examples today, right? If you want to be a pipe fitter, that's special knowledge. You're more likely than not going to be in a union if you're a pipe fitter. But if you work at McDonald's, we're going to call that job unskilled and pay you less. It does require a lot of skill to do that job, but it's kind of the nomenclature. So when you have the government coming out and saying even unskilled, quote unquote unskilled industrial workers have a right to be in a union, it makes it less and less possible for a company to intimidate and prevent unionization among its industrial workers. The threat of firing doesn't really hold as much sway if as a worker they can't fire you legally for participating in a union drive. And so within the American Federation of Labor, which with the decline of the IWW is kind of the remaining labor federation in the United States, within the AFL, there are increased calls for industrial organizing, right? We have the ability to start organizing unskilled workers. We should do this. United Mine Workers of America is one of these AFL unions that is more industrial than craft and starts to call for greater industrial organizing. Within the AFL, the American Federation of Labor finally consents, and they're like, all right, we're going to create a committee, and 8 of these larger craft unions can join it, and they can kind of work together on organizing unskilled laborers in other industries. It's called the Committee for Industrial Organization, or CIO. Now, the CIO immediately starts to kind of run up against the entrenched AFL leadership and other specific craft unions. The CIO is more confrontational in its organizing. It's a lot more militant and in a lot of ways more akin to the IWW than these respectable AFL craft institutions. Now, at the end of World War I and the start of the 1920s, the AFL backs up considerably from these more militant confrontations with businesses and the state because it's just a very easy, quick way to lose strikes. And as the Great Depression starts to as the country moves into the Great Depression and calls for industrial organizing start to pick up, the militancy of the CIO really puts the AFL off, right? This isn't going to win us any organizing drives. It's bad optics, it's bad politics, and we're going to suffer for it if you keep on with these confrontational strategies. More than this, though, a lot of the tension between this emerging CIO and the existing AFL comes from the strategy of industrial organizing itself, right? If you are of the belief that a union should organize all workers in a given industry, regardless of your craft or your specific skill, that means that you're going to be recruiting members out of existing craft unions, right? So let's take the auto industry, for example. If you're trying to organize auto workers, not only are you going to try and organize line workers who are seen as unskilled, but you're also going to try and organize other skilled workers in the auto industry. If you're only organizing unskilled, quote unquote, unskilled line workers and not these skilled trades workers, it's not really an industrial union. It's just a craft union for workers who are, deemed unskilled. So any sort of union that tried to organize the entire automotive industry would need to take members from existing craft unions that covered things that, so if you're a millwright, if you're a machinist, if you're a tool and die maker, if you're an iron molder or a welder, any of these sorts of these craft positions that probably had their own craft union, if you were trying to recruit them into your industrial union, that is a charge of dual unionism. Now, because of these differences and because of increased competition, the following year after the CIO, this Committee for Industrial Organizing, is made, the AFL kicks it out. They said, essentially, you're stealing members from other craft organizations, you're too confrontational, this was a mistake. We are suspending these 8 unions and 2 others that you've created since we founded this Committee for Industrial Organizing. This happens again and again in the labor movement. There's competition, federations break up, sometimes they rejoin. When these 10 industrial unions within the AFL are suspended, instead of disbanding and reforming into a bunch of different craft associations that they had been prior, they instead decide to leave and continue their work, but they change their name, right? They're not a committee for industrial organizing anymore. They are an actual group of industrial unions, but they don't want to change the acronym unnecessarily. CIO had been kind of gaining in popularity, and so they reorganize as the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And the Congress of Industrial Organizations is a committee of 10 industrial unions that had been suspended by the AFL during the Great Depression, but instead of disbanding, formed their own competing labor federation to advance industrial unionism. Right, so the AFL is very much still kind of steeped in craft unionism and this kind of respectability politics toward industrial organizing, whereas the CIO is a lot more militant and it's a lot more aggressive in its desire to organize an entire industry regardless of craft or skill. And so that puts these 2 federations in competition with each other. Now, what we're going to do for the remainder of the lecture is talk very briefly about 2 different organizing drives that the CIO undertakes. And that is the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, or SWOC, and the United Auto Workers of America, or UAW. Now, immediately with the founding of the CIO, there is a push to organize steelworkers. For a very long time, steelworkers were some of the most skilled and highly compensated members of the labor aristocracy. This is earlier on in America's industrial history, like the 1870s, 1880s. With the construction of the railroads, you need a lot of steel, a very good, efficient steel in order to lay enough tracks, for example. So there's a lot of demand for steel workers. Steel work itself is a very kind of technical and specialized skill. And so steel workers are able to use their monopoly on that skilled knowledge in order to make some pretty good wages. This starts to change, however, when Andrew Carnegie's Carnegie Steel Company begins de-skilling steel work. They do this first by importing something known as the Bessemer process from Europe. Bessemer process, not to go into too much detail about it, basically allowed Carnegie Steel Company and other steel companies making steel to de-skill the work in the steel industry, make it a lot easier for people to do without years and years of extensive training, but also to create more of it and to create higher quality steel. This moves control of the productive process out of the workers' hands, and when it's easier to replace steel workers with a de-skilled kind of task, this means that you can eventually start to drive down wages and make even more profits in the industry. As time goes on, Carnegie Steel and these other steel companies start to add further innovations onto the Bessemer process that completely essentially strip the steel workers of any sort of bargaining rights. And this is because the process of steel production had become so de-skilled that there wasn't really, if you walked out of the job, they could just throw anyone off the street onto the job, more or less. It also doesn't help that Carnegie pursued a policy of vertical integration. So this allows him to basically have a virtual monopoly on US steel production. So you have the Bessemer process. The Bessemer process is then supplanted with the open hearth system, a diagram of that you can see on the right, that basically makes it possible for the mass production of very high quality steel, while at the same time kind of removing any sort of craft control steel workers had originally, kind of removing that control from the process. Now, back in 1892, steelworkers were skilled steelworkers, right? Are organized by a union that was a craft union that was known as the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, or AA. So you're going to see AA in these slides. It's not Alcoholics Anonymous, it's the Amalgamated Association. Now, for a very long time in its history, AA was able to negotiate decent contracts with Carnegie Steel on behalf of its members. Carnegie didn't really want to try to break the union. He saw a lot of labor unrest and labor violence kind of going in negative directions up until this point. The 1877 Great Railroad Strike led to a lot of bloodshed and violence. This might not be that great for the steel industry if you had a huge bloody strike break and all of your steel workers who had all of this special skill decided they didn't want to work for you anymore after that. You might not be able to retain the labor you needed in order to run your operation. But by 1892, the iron and steel working in Carnegie Steel had been de-skilled to the point where it became possible to break the union. And ultimately, Carnegie Steel decides to try to do this at their massive steel foundry plant in Homestead, Pennsylvania, right? They have this enormous Bessemer steel industrial plant. It's been recently kind of innovated and added onto, so it has this like incredibly efficient and incredibly de-skilled open hearth firing system. And so Carnegie Steel goes to AA and they says, hey, you're going to take a 22% wage decrease, and we're not going to give you any sorts of benefits. You know, you're not going to give you any reduction of hours. We're actually going to ask you to work more hours for less pay, all of these concessions. Carnegie basically throws out these very egregious conditions in order to get the AA to go into a strike that he can then break, right? If you go in with only 5 or 10% wage cuts, you know, it's a bad economy. Maybe the union will agree to that and you're stuck in another contract lasting so many years. So Carnegie Steel puts out these very egregious cuts in wages and everything to basically goad AA into a strike, and it works. The Amalgamated Association walks out of the Homestead plant to go on strike. But instead of the company trying to negotiate with the union, they do what's called a lockout. They close and lock the doors, say, okay, well, you can't come back in. And then they start bringing in strike breaker scab labor to replace these skilled steel workers on jobs that had been de-skilled with the open hearth furnace system. Now, that being said, this walkout in Homestead was fairly extensive, right? There's a lot of workers outside of the Homestead plant. They are refusing to leave. They're on strike. They're going to picket outside of the foundry. This makes it kind of difficult for Carnegie Steel to bring in strike break labor, right? You can't really get them into the plant if there's no way to get inside without, strike breakers blocking the plant entrance. So Carnegie Steel brings in a private army and detective agency known as the Pinkertons. They are eventually surrounded by the strikers and forced to kind of give up their effort to break into homesteads so that they can bring in strike break labor. The organized AA workers, there's just too many of them. They eventually force the Pinkertons and this private army to retreat from Homestead. Pennsylvania's state militia is brought in as backup, but they're unable to actually get the AA to leave Homestead. And throughout this entire period of violence, the Amalgamated Association has been incredibly conciliatory. This leads political representatives to start pressuring Henry Frick, who is the chairman of Carnegie Steel. Andrew Carnegie at the time, who is actually head of the company, is off in Europe gallivanting around. So Henry Frick is this anti-union kind of union buster who Carnegie has left in charge to take care of this. Political leaders start to pressure Henry Frick into negotiating with the union. This happened in the anthracite strike, if you recall that, which is happening around the same time. There's this desire to reach a conciliatory tone between labor and management that the progressives in government really are starting to want. Anthracite is not going to take place for another 10 years, though, and you don't have as much public pressure on Carnegie Steel to settle with workers as you might have had in 1902. This pressure is starting to build up, but 3 weeks into the strike, an anarchist who isn't actually affiliated with the AA, he tries to assassinate Frick. He gets into his office, he shoots him like 5 or 6 times, stabs him a bunch, but somehow does not manage to kill Frick. This actually leads to pretty widespread condemnation for the strike, despite the fact that this anarchist wasn't really affiliated with it. And this decline in public opinion in favor of the union ultimately leads to a strike's collapse. All of that public pressure that was coming from political representatives for Carnegie Steel to settle the strike start to fall through. I don't want to be charged of being a sympathizer to anarchists. The AFL had initially promised to call a boycott against Carnegie Steel. They ultimately decide to about face on this. Calling a boycott, if you recall from the American Railways Union's experience with Pullman in the Great Railroad Strike in 1877, a boycott was a very effective way to organize a strike outside of that actual industry. But the federal government was very anti-boycott because it was seen as an attack on industry. So the AFL would have been risking a lot by doing this. After this assassination attempt, they're like, yeah, it's not worth it. So there's no boycott called. And by November of that year, the strike had collapsed. The Amalgamated Association will participate in 2 more strikes after that. One was an attempt to win back union recognition. After Homestead, the Homestead strike, the union it's unrecognized. It isn't able to bargain any more contracts with Carnegie Steel. And in 1901, 9 years later, they try and fix this problem, but they're resoundingly defeated. And then another strike takes place in 1919 as part of this wider push to extend these wartime protections that workers enjoyed into peacetime. We recall from the end of our last lecture, the AFL was doing that in a number of industries, and those are defeated as well. So by the time you have the Wagner Act being passed in 1935, and you see the creation of the National Labor Relations Board, there has not been a union that has adequately represented steelworkers for the better part of 15 years now. And even when you did have the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, or Steel and Iron Workers, I think steel comes first. When you did still have that union with any sort of political power, it wasn't really able to contest business prerogatives since like the previous century. Now, the AA is still technically around, right? There's a couple of people who are still involved in the union. They don't represent a lot of workers anymore. The Pinkertons Detective Agency and Carnegie Steel have made sure of that. In 1901, Carnegie Steel actually combines with a number of other large steel companies to create United States Steel, or USS. The arrival of the CIO brings a lot of renewed interest in organizing the steel industry, especially because this idea of industrial unionism rests not on exclusive craft skill, but on worker solidarity directly across the entire industry. And so the CIO, in kind of response to this renewed interest, creates the Steel Workers Organizing Committee, or SWOC. The SWOC reaches out to the remaining members of the Amalgamated Association, and they start to cooperate on these sorts of initiatives. So even though the AA is technically with AFL and SWOC is technically with CIO, the chances of industrial organizing working out ultimately lead the AA to start cooperating with the CIO, even if the AFL didn't want it to. So US Steel, which is the successor to Carnegie Steel, and smaller industries like Republic Steel, they start to fight back against these organizing drives by basically firing workers for even suggesting that they might support an organizing drive or vote for a union in a union election. Companies like USS that had a lot more funds to kind of maintain control of their workers would hire company spies like the Pinkertons to attend union meetings to find out who was in on unionization drives so that they could be fired later, usually on trumped up charges. You know, we sent a spy to the Steelworkers Organizing Committee meeting and they said these 3 workers were there. It's like, all right, well, by the end of the week, keep an eye on them on the steel foundry, have the supervisors find a reason to fire them or get rid of them. A lot of these charges were usually trumped up. How long was that break? 10 minutes. Well, you were only supposed to get, 5, so you're out. Goodbye. In 1936, SWOC organizers were working to build support for a unionization drive at Jones and Laughlin Steel Company. This is one of the smaller steel companies that are not as big as United States Steel, but are still big enough to hire detective agencies like the Pinkertons to spy on workers and fire workers if it turns out they're trying to organize it all. There's a unionization drive at Jones and Laughlin, which the company responds to with blanket firing. So basically everyone who's organized in the unionization drive, they find out about and they fire them all. They say, it's because you're trying to organize. It's because you're trying to unionize. You can't do that at our company, so you're fired. SWOC contacts the National Labor Relations Board, which was created by the NLRA, or the Wagner Act. And they said, hey, you're supposed to be protecting our rights to organize. Look at what's going on at Jones and Laughlin Steel Company. The NLRB investigates the matter and orders that, in fact, Jones and Laughlin violated the National Labor Relations Act. They're like, hey, you can't fire people because they're trying to organize a union. So the NLRB orders Jones and Laughlin to rehire the fired SWOC workers. And the company, instead of doing so, appeals to the Supreme Court. They argued that the NLRA was unconstitutional. Similar challenges had led to the NIRA, this National Industrial Recovery Act from the first New Deal. It's overturned in the Supreme Court a year earlier in 1935. It's why the Wagner Act is ultimately passed, is to replace it. So the following year, in NLRB versus Jones and Laughlin Steel Corporation, the Supreme Court upholds the constitutionality of the Wagner Act in a 5-4 decision. This is a pretty big deal because it means that not only is the government taking the side of unions and the rights of workers to collectively bargain and organize, but it also means that the Supreme Court is recognizing that that right is a constitutional right, and that the government making sure that those rights are protected does not violate other portions of the U.S. Constitution that had previously said were happening under NERA and earlier attempts to protect workers, right? So if you'll recall from our last lecture, you have a number of state or city law codes that are being established, you know, setting an 8-hour workday or basically requiring a certain wage rate. And these were all being struck down during the Progressive era by the U.S. Supreme Court because they were, you know, unconstitutional. The government shouldn't be involved in business. By the time we have the Wagner Act, this attitude has changed, and the U.S. Supreme Court is taking a less of an anti-labor stance as well. So SWOC is starting to succeed, but a lot of these successes are very hard fought. Regardless of this, though, CIO-led organizing drives are starting to encourage other workers. Support for SWOC itself continued to grow despite continued resistance to unionization efforts by major companies like Republic or USS. Some of these companies, like Jones and McLaughlin, were smaller organizations. USS was much larger. In 1937, so 2 years after the Wagner Act is passed, steelworkers marching in support of the Steelworkers Organizing Committee in Chicago outside Republic Steel's mills are fired upon by the Chicago police. This is known as the Memorial Day Massacre. 10 workers in this action are killed and over 100 more are severely wounded. So the federal government might be saying workers have the right to collectively bargain. The Supreme Court might be saying that workers have the right to collectively bargain, but there are still local apparatuses that are controlled largely by these major companies that are fighting this. And this is in a lot of ways a repeat of what we saw earlier in the century, and then at the end of the last century taking place out west in places like Colorado, right? You might have a state government say that workers have the right to collectively bargain. You might have a state Supreme Court say the workers have a right to collectively bargain. But if half of your state is company towns that are controlled by these coal industries, right, like Colorado Fuel and Iron, if they control the police, if they control enough political power to oust your progressive state government from power, then how effective are labor's gains really here? So a big part of the actual fight of the CIO, first in getting these kinds of legal rights enshrined in not only in things like the National Labor Relations Act or the Wagner Act, but also in Supreme Court decisions. That's just part of the fight here. They also need to effectively challenge company power on a local basis. By the 1940s, though, economic conditions, they had continued to improve, but industrial wages hadn't. Continued disparities between companies and workers in the steel industry, kind of the lack of a remedy for lower wages and struggles that workers have been going through at the time. There's not a lot of headway being made here, despite the fact that the economy is recovering, and this turns public support for the Steelworkers Organizing Committee. It increases it over time. By spring of 1941, United States Steel and a lot of these other companies kind of combined into the term known as Little Steel. So you have Republic, you have Jones and McLaughlin. All of these companies start having to bargain and signing contracts with the Steelworkers Organizing Committee. And this is because not only of government pressure, but also of public pressure and CIO and legal pressure too. After the Steelworkers Organizing Committee starts signing these agreements, they officially merge with the Amalgamated Association of Steel and Iron Workers to form the new United Steelworkers of America, which itself was affiliated with the CIO. So we've talked about the steel industry. It initially used to be an industry that was very much guided by craft skill, by workers' control of the productive process. This control was lost through the process of de-skilling. Wages and workers' compensation, workers' benefits, and other rights that workers had declined with this monopoly on skill that came with the de-skilling process. But industrial unionism starts to offset this de-skilling process by organizing workers not on terms of skill or craft associations, but based on industrial ties and solidarity. Unlike the steel industry, though, we're going to look at the United Auto Workers, and it's worth mentioning that the auto industry does not have the same history of worker organization that the steel industry had, right? So when the Steelworkers Organizing Committee and the Amalgamated Association are calling for workers to organize, join unions, they're able to look back on a previous history of unionization and say, look, we used to have this before, we can have it again, you should join our organizing drive. The auto industry is almost entirely new. You have automobiles sold in the United States as early as the 1890s, but making cars is a labor-intensive and time-consuming process. And a lot of craft workers are more or less represented if they aren't general laborers in the automotive industry prior to this process of de-skilling. In the auto industry, it's actually the assembly line and a lot of automation in different skilled tasks that lead to the de-skilling of the auto industry fairly early on. Henry Ford's assembly line is a good example of this, right? The de-skilling of this labor means that craft unions just don't have the same amount of ability to negotiate over wages, over rates of work, over shop floor rules, over benefits that they had prior. Now, Detroit's also unique because it's not like the earlier industrial Northeast where you had, where cities like Boston or New York or Philadelphia had been sites of industrial manufacturing for a very long time. Detroit really only emerges as a major center of industrial production in the 1920s, or at least like a little bit before that point. There's a huge economic boom in Detroit around this time during this period of post-war prosperity, where the auto industry very much solidifies around the city of Detroit. Now, because Detroit was so heavily enmeshed in industrial manufacturing, when the Great Depression hits, it actually hits Detroit pretty hard. So in 1932, for example, the national unemployment rate is very high. It's at 26%. But Detroit, by comparison, because it's so industrially focused and a lot of this New Deal collapse is specific to a couple of industrial industries and agriculture, Detroit's unemployment rate is much higher at about 33%. Detroit's unemployment rate during the Great Depression is actually among the highest unemployment rates we see in the entire world at this time. And so this makes automobile unionization pretty risky, right? Literally, if you go out on strike, the idea is that a third of the city at any given time, unemployment rate is ready to take your position. It makes organizing in the industry incredibly risky. It makes it very easy for a company to replace a worker, especially since a lot of these labor processes are being de-skilled at this time. Now, labor gains at this point are usually won by impromptu and planned walkouts. These are sometimes called wildcat strikes. Other labor gains are made by supervisors having not necessarily a progressive orientation toward labor relations, but if you didn't pay a worker enough and they could actually get a job somewhere else being paid more, there was an incentive for you to pay a certain amount to keep workers working at your factory, right? So the $5 day, Henry Ford comes out with this policy of the $5 day earlier on in the century to basically combat the issue of turnover. If we need 5,000 workers to have our factory running, and every time we replace a worker, they quit within a month, we have to put a lot of our resources into constantly hiring workers who are leaving. So if you can convince a worker that the grueling job that you have in these auto factories is worth staying at, you can reduce turnover and you can kind of save some of your costs. So you do start to see the increase of some wages in the auto industry prior to the Great Depression, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the auto industries during the Great Depression are going to continue to raise wages. Right? We were paying you $5 a day in 1920. We're going through hardened economic times now. We're not going to pay you more than $5 a day now, even though you might need to make considerably more in order to support your family or much less buy any of the cars we're making. So turnover and the wildcat strike was really the way up until this point that you were going to be able to win any kind of concessions. A wildcat strike really only takes place because any sort of attempt at forming a long-lasting union is pretty resolutely crushed. If you try and organize workers, prior to the Wagner Act, there's not a lot to fall back on. You can't really rely on your monopoly of a specific craft or trade skill. So the best way that you could win concessions in a strike is if the strike is more or less unplanned and unmediated or ungoverned by a long-lasting labor body, because it means that instead of defeating the union, which for lack of a better term doesn't have that much of a presence, the managers of a factory basically have to, how do we get people in the door? And they have to therefore directly negotiate with wildcat strikes a lot of the time. But a wildcat strike is a work stoppage, walkout, or strike launched without the support or planning of a governing union. After the National Labor Relations Board comes into creation, the Wagner Act is passed in 1935, most unions start to oppose wildcat strikes, because one of the main things that makes unions look like they're worth negotiating with is this idea of organizational discipline, right? If workers are organized in a union and they're launching wildcat strikes without union approval, that does not make the union look strong, and it does not make employers think that by negotiating with the union that they can basically make sure that their turnover rates and their production doesn't have a lot of substantial problems. So after the New Deal, wildcat strikes are less favored by unions, but up until the Wagner Act, wildcat strikes are a pretty efficient way for some workers to get rights, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're always effective necessarily. And then you have turnover, which is the rate at which percent of a company's employees quit in a given year. So in our book, Our Readings Manhood on the Line, we were talking about how some auto companies had an annual turnover rate of 300%. That means that in order to operate a factory of 5,000 workers, they had to hire 15,000 workers every year because so many people were quitting. So let's talk about the auto industry and unionization prior to the National Labor Relations Act, the Wagner Act, right? Prior to the NLRA, auto workers had little recourse against auto manufacturers. As the Great Depression started to get worse and worse in Detroit, you had a lot of charitable organizations and civic organizations try to supply unemployed workers with food. But in a city like Detroit, where the unemployment rate is 33%, you're not going to be able to supply that food indefinitely, right? And some of these organizations the civic organizations, these charities start to run low on funds. This put already precarious families without, shelter or food or employment in dire straits. And so across the country, in a lot of cities like Detroit, where the effects of the Great Depression are specifically hard felt and pronounced, you have unionists working with other leftists like socialists, communists, and anarchists to put together unemployed councils in a lot of these major cities. And this is basically to organize unemployed workers to demand greater relief from government. Now, if you're a communist and you're participating in these unemployed councils, you have the added desire to overthrow the capitalist system, right? You want to see a Russian Revolution in the United States if you're a communist, but most of the participants in these unemployed councils are really trying to organize unemployed workers the same way unions are trying to organize workers in a specific industry. And that is by gathering all of the unemployed, 33% of Detroit together into one organization, into one council, you might be able to convince the city to provide better relief for workers. Now in Detroit, workers in the city's unemployed council joined one of the earlier and more radical aspiring auto workers unions, called the Auto Aircraft and Vehicle Workers of America, or the AAVWA. The AAVWA is one of these craft unions associated with the AFL. It's not strictly an industrial union, but it is trying to organize a greater span of industrial workers who might somehow fall out of the ranks of skilled craft workers normally organized by the AFL. The AAVWA and Detroit's Unemployed Council start to cooperate and organize something called the Ford Hunger March. This was a protest of Ford Corporation's firing of unionists and who are trying to organize auto workers, and also a protest against Ford for a perceived lack of support for the unemployed. A lot of workers had been working at Ford for years, even decades, up to this point in the 1930s. And when there is financial trouble, Ford as a company basically cuts its losses, even if those losses are workers, and says, hey, we can't afford to employ all of these people, so we're going to fire you. No, we're not going to provide you with any sort of compensation or like lasting relief until you can find another job. You're just kind of on your own here. Kind of a rude thing to do. So the Auto Aircraft and Vehicle Workers of America and the Unemployed Council launched this Ford Hunger March in 1932. About 5,000 workers meet in downtown Detroit, and they march to the city of Dearborn, which is nominally still one of these company towns that's controlled by Ford, right? So in Hamtramck and Highland Park, you have Chrysler. In Dearborn, you have Ford. Up in Pontiac and in Flint, you have General Motors, where these automotive companies have a lot of say and control over how city governments are run. Detroit is not beyond influence from the auto industry, but it's less directly controlled by companies like Ford. Auto workers are able to assemble and peacefully march up to Dearborn's city boundary when they are greeted with remarkable police violence. Now, this part of the Hunger March is sometimes known as the Ford Massacre, and it ends the Ford Hunger March when Dearborn police shoot and kill 4 workers and wound over 60 others, either by gunshot or bayonet wounds. Hearings by the city of Dearborn after the Ford Massacre and the end of the Ford Hunger March, keep in mind that Dearborn is nominally still a company town controlled by Ford. They basically lay blame for the massacre on the shoulders of the 5,000 workers participating in the march, saying you didn't have the clearance to march to Dearborn's downtown. We needed to protect private property in the city. Our officers did what they needed to do. Even at the time, the response of the Dearborn judiciary and the Dearborn city government was kind of, it was greeted with reproach by a lot of Michiganders who, upon hearing stories about the Hunger March and the Ford Massacre, very much felt that Ford and the police of Dearborn were to blame for this. The march was incredibly peaceful up until it reached Dearborn city limits. The Auto, Aircraft, and Vehicle Workers of America are crushed as a result of the Hunger March. They're not one of these unions that makes it for a very long time. But the AAVWA and this Unemployed Council's attempt to basically call Ford to task for abandoning so many workers in the middle of the Great Depression, and Ford and Dearborn's response to these protests ultimately serves to radicalize a lot of workers either in the auto industry or in related industries so that they might be more sympathetic to auto worker organizations. And so with the passage of the NLRA and the Wagner Act and the creation of the National Labor Relations Board, auto workers and their allies start to try to replace the defunct AAVWA. This leads to the founding of the United Auto Workers of America, or UAW, sometimes Earlier on in its history, it's known as the UAWA. It's founded by the American Federation of Labor in 1935 as a part of this wider Committee for Industrial Organizing. Of course, if you remember back earlier on in the lecture, in order to organize an auto workers union, if you want to organize a United Auto Workers, a UAW, you need to include a lot of workers who are already organized under these much smaller and more specific craft organizations. Now, by consolidating all of these craft unionized workers into one industrial union, it's very, you can very easily argue that it's more effective as an approach toward collective bargaining. But if you are the leader of one of these smaller craft unions and all of your members are starting to leave to join this United Auto Workers, you're going to get a little upset because, well, that's dual unionism. They're stealing our members. And so, like the other earlier industrial unions associated with this committee, the UAW is suspended in 1936, but instead of disbanding, the members of the UAW ultimately just agreed to join the newly created Congress of Industrial Organizations. Now, the new CIO is privileging the Steelworkers Organizing Committee as its kind of chief organizing interest in the 1930s. The leader of the CIO, John Lewis, who was, prior to this point, the leader of the United Mine Workers, he's really pressing other organizations in the CIO to lay low until the Steelworkers Organizing Committee can successfully unionize the steel industry. But the UAW leaders don't really want to wait around until the steel industry is organizing, and they actually begin to launch their own union campaign. Industrial organizing in the UAW, of course, leads to organizing across racial, gender, and ethnic lines. This wins the UAW its own enemies. The KKK and the UAW did not get along during this period. So the UAW refuses to wait on the rest of the CIO, and it starts to challenge auto companies as early as 1936 with a far more radical tactic than some of these other CIO unions have been willing to entertain. And that is the sit-down strike. Now, if you think back to Homestead, if you think about the Amalgamated Association of Steel and Iron Workers, when they decided to go on strike at Homestead, they walked out of the Homestead foundry and they started picketing the plant, right? This foundry, this mill. This made it very easy for Carnegie Steel and these other steel companies to simply just lock the doors and say, well, all right, we're going to wait for the police and our own little army to get here so they can escort strike break scab labor into our mill. And you guys can just stay outside and we're not going to be down too much productivity. We'll be able to outlast this strike. The sit-down strike instead directly challenged the property rights of major manufacturing companies by occupying the buildings and sites of work. So instead of leaving a plant, workers would occupy the plant, basically bar the doors, shut off the machines, and refuse to leave until the company had negotiated with them. This is a very radical tactic. If you think it's not, just think about the Occupy protests that emerged at the start of and end of the last decade. Or if you think about the protests that have been involved this past summer, occupations don't happen very often, and that's because they're more or less perceived as a much greater threat to industry than a simple walkout. A simple walkout means, hey, we can just pack up our things and leave, and you're going to be without work, and a company can very easily replace work, especially if an industry is de-skilled. With a sit-down strike, which is a tactic where instead of calling for workers to leave a workplace, unions instruct workers to remain at their jobs and not work. By doing that, by occupying factory buildings and denying strike breakers access to machines, sit-down strikes make it more difficult for a company to circumvent bargaining through lockouts. So it's a much greater threat to industry, and it's entirely, reasonable to believe that a response to a sit-down strike might be more heavy-handed than a response to just a simple walkout. In 1936, the UAW plans and organizes a sit-down strike of the largest auto producer at the time, General Motors. Now we have an entire chapter in Loomis's 10 strikes that you're going to read on this, that we're going to be covering in our class discussion. So we're not going to get too much into the Flint sit-down strike in this lecture. But this ultimately comes of the UAW's first large sit-down strike. They had tested this out in a couple of smaller factories and plants. Briggs Automotive is one. There is a GM foundry down in Atlanta, Georgia, where they successfully test out the sit-down strike. And so in December of 1936, the UAW kicks off a massive sit-down strike that occupies several key plants in the Flint area that are like kind of core to GM's vehicle production. The sit-down strike lasts 44 days from December 30th of 1936 until mid-February the following year. And it ends only after workers are able to successfully battle with Flint police and overtake plants that GM was still running using scab labor when the strike actually began. When the strike finally ends, GM is forced to admit defeat and agree to recognize the UAW as the only bargainer for its workers after the governor of Michigan refuses to deploy the National Guard to Flint to break the strike. The Flint Police Department for 44 days had been unable to kind of force workers out of these factories. The UAW leads a couple of contingents of workers to overtake a couple more factories, like a gear and axle transmission plant. Once this happens, GM's vehicle production grinds to a halt, and its competitors are starting to, take up more and more of its market share. Flint police pump tear gas into these GM plants in Flint to basically force workers, you can leave the factory or you can suffocate. The UAW organizes wives of these workers into their women's auxiliaries. You can see a picture of them over here on the left. They, in response to this tear gas attack on a lot of these factories, would run down Flint's city streets while they're being shot at by the police. And they used whatever implements they could find to break the windows on these factory buildings. Again, you're going against the property rights of the company here by doing this, but by breaking all of these windows, there is enough airflow in these factories to get the tear gas out of the building, and workers are able to stay inside. At other points, the Flint police aim water hoses at picketing workers during the brutal cold of the night. You might imagine hypothermia to follow after being sprayed by a water hose in a February night battle with the police. But in spite of all of this, the UAW is able to maintain control of these plants. They aren't able to be kicked out. The governor of Michigan refuses to send in the National Guard to murder anyone in order for GM to kind of make their rebound in their profits. And so the UAW wins the Flint sit-down strike in February of 1937. Walter Reuther, who is actually one of the lead organizers in the strike, would eventually head the UAW. He takes over as president in 1946 and will lead the UAW until his death in 1970. Following the success of the Flint sit-down strike, the UAW organizes workers at other companies like Chrysler and begins building up resources to organize workers at Ford. Ford was one of the most anti-union bulwarks in the American industrial system up until this time. They were also the last of the major three automakers made up of GM, Chrysler, and Ford to recognize the UAW and bargain over a contract with them. Now, the UAW's campaigns to organize workers at Ford were entirely peaceful at the outset, but union organizers and protesters were often brutally attacked and beaten. This occurs repeatedly throughout the UAW's history at Ford, but one particular notable incident was the Battle of the Overpass. This happens shortly after the UAW's victory at GM. UAW organizers start to pass leaflets out on these overpass bridges that allow workers access to Ford's River Rouge plant and other plants in the area. You know, it's very hard to get 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 workers into a plant for a shift change if they have to walk across the street. And so you have these very large, as you can see them on the left here, these very large pedestrian overpasses. The UAW went out to pass flyers at these overpasses during shift changes, and they were attacked by Ford security guards, which is also known as the Ford Service Department, if you're recalling from your Manhood on the Line readings. But they were attacked by Ford security in a very publicized incident known as the Battle of the Overpass. Whatever kind of public approval the Fords had and the Ford Corporation had began to plummet as accounts of brutality against peaceful union organizers, peaceful protesters, and workers who had grievances. As these start to gain public notice, support for Ford declines until ultimately in 1941, Ford also has to sign an agreement that recognizes the UAW. So where does this leave us? Well, 1941, if you are familiar with history dates, is the start of World War II. The US is going to be incredibly involved in that, and labor is going to take on a key role in how the UAW engages with World War II. And so that's actually going to be the focus of our next lecture for November 9th, right? That one will go live on November 2nd. But we have some takeaways. The first, I think, is said best by Walter Reuther. In 1970, just a few weeks before his death, he said, quote, "There is a direct relationship between the ballot box and the bread box, and what the union fights for and wins at the bargaining table can be taken away in the legislative halls." Throughout American history up until this point, there was a desire to organize workers. There was a desire for industrial unionism, and there was a desire for a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, regardless of how skilled or unskilled, quote unquote, you were in your day-to-day life. Industrial unionism isn't able to take place, however, really until there is a recognition of the rights of workers enshrined by the government and the court system. So if you are a supporter of organized labor, if you are a supporter of workers' rights, Walter Reuther, one of these head organizers for the Flint sit-down strike and the later UAW, would tell you that you should vote. Political history and labor history are very much intertwined. Also, it's that even if you have rights that are enshrined in the judiciary and in the legislative halls, they can still be combated by companies, corrupt police, company towns. When you see injustice, don't assume that the system is broken. It just needs some fixing. So remember, a wildcat strike is a work stoppage that is not organized by a union. After the New Deal and the passage of the Wagner Act, unions try to make these wildcat strikes less popular, because a wildcat strike usually symbolizes to industrial heads that you don't have the support of your union members, of workers, and so why would that company negotiate with you? Turnover is the rate at which a company's employees quit in a given year. A high turnover means that the company probably isn't giving high enough compensation for the work. A low turnover means it's a desirable place to work usually, though not always. A sit-down strike is a more radical strike tactic where instead of leaving a workplace and protest of grievances to pickets, unions occupy points of production and instruct workers to remain at their jobs and to not work. And again, police and state violence against organized labor, working class and community movements can be extensive and lethal, even if those movements started and remain nonviolent. That's true about the massacres that take place in Chicago, as well as the massacres that take place in Dearborn following a hunger march. Government's attitude toward the labor movement, workers' rights, and democratic governments can prove the deciding factor between the success or failure of working class movements. Again, it is November 2nd is what this lecture class period is for. If I don't reiterate this enough in our actual class discussion, I'll reiterate it now. Please make sure you vote. Even with tacit support from state and federal governments, which included legal protections and enforcement mechanisms to protect labor rights, organization drives against major American companies were still hard fought, and they were grueling campaigns. So for our November 2nd class, make sure to read Stephen Meyer's Manhood on the Line. That's chapters 3 through 5, and then pick one of the other two. You can read Loomis's chapter 6 of Tent Strikes, which talks about the Flint sit-down strike and the New Deal. Or you can read Elizabeth Howe's Rethinking the American Labor Movement, which talks about rebuilding the movement, 1922 to 1945. They are very much, they overlap quite a bit, but they have a little bit different of focus. Rethinking kind of talks more about the labor movement as a whole, whereas the Flint sit-down strike and the New Deal focuses a bit more on the United Auto Workers. Whichever one you want to read is up to you. We will be discussing both of those in addition to Manhood on the Line on November 2nd, though. Again, if you have any questions, don't be afraid to reach out to me via email. I'm always willing to respond, and we'll be making sure to be checking my email more often than not as we're going through this week working on our midterm exams. Wish you all the best. Good luck in your exams, though I don't think you'll need it. But if you do, I, again, am here to help. Until next week.